In this video, let's review sections 8.1 and 8.2 of the final unit of AP Biology on ecology. Hey guys, this is Mikey with Avo Prep Academy, and on this channel we cover AP Bio content. And in today's video, we'll take a brief look at sections 8.1 and 8.2, which deals with organisms' response to their environments, as well as the energy flow through the ecosystem. To be completely honest, 8.1 on the response to the environment draws on many different topics from various chapters, and many ideas are also discussed in both population and community ecology. So it goes without saying that this part of the video will be kind of brief. First, the curriculum wants students to understand that organisms do not exist in a vacuum, but rather are a part of their environment. This means that not only do you have organisms responding to real-time changes in their environment, but they also harbor evolutionary and adaptive history with their environments as well. But in terms of real-time changes, we can look at an example from our earlier study of the lactoperon, where the bacteria responded to the presence of lactose in their environment by the induction of genes encoding for the metabolism of lactose. But in slightly more complex organisms, we see both the nervous and the endocrine systems working together to help organisms respond to danger by initiating the fight or flight response. This is a mode that the organism can go into where they physiologically prepare for a fight or an escape. And this can mean the release of sugars into the bloodstream, dilation of the pupils to let more light in, increased heart rate, and the list goes on. In fact, you probably have felt this response before if you've ever played any sports or had to stand in front of a crowd to give a speech. Now, while you don't need to know the exact mechanisms of how this response is initiated, it might be worthwhile knowing that the typical trigger is the release of a hormone called epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. And it just happens to be the case that this very hormone is what Earl W. Sutherland investigated in his discovery of the signal transduction pathway that we talked about in chapter 11. But in terms of evolutionary adaptations that help organisms respond to external environments or other stimuli, we have examples like photoperiodism, where plants can respond to light and dark cycles, with an example including the timing of flowers that open and close as they track the length of each cycle through chemical means that are happening within their cells. Now, organisms can also respond to other living things as well. Here, the curriculum wants you to know that birds can sing songs to attract mates, prey fish can release alarm pheromones to warn each other, and venomous and poisonous species often use elaborate coloration and patterns to warn potential enemies. But with these specific interactions, we dive much deeper into them in our community ecology anyways. Now, one additional topic covered in this unit, which technically should have been covered in Unit 7 on evolution, is kin selection. As the name suggests, kin selection is the idea that organisms may behave in ways that appear to decrease their individual fitness in order to increase the fitness of its closely related relatives like siblings. So let's assume that your offspring share roughly 50% of your genes. As a result, having two children would ensure that roughly 100% of your genes have been passed down to your offspring. Now, on the other hand, your siblings share, again, about 50% of your genes, which means that their offspring, so your nieces and nephews, would share roughly 25% of your genes. So imagining a case in which a sibling produces 8 offspring, that would be roughly equivalent to you passing on 200% of your genes. So between the choice of having 2 offspring of your own or 8 nieces and nephews, the evolutionary calculator would lean on the side of ensuring that your siblings are in fact successful in having all those 8 children. Now, I know that this example oversimplifies a very complex issue, as there are no guarantees of any outcomes based on your actions in our universe, but evolution does in fact act like a large calculator that, through selection, can produce behaviors that seem counterintuitive to those guaranteeing individual success. Some major examples of kin selection include prairie dogs that have guards that put their lives at risk to ensure that their kin is alerted when predators come nearby. Extreme examples of kin selection can include eusocial organisms such as bees and ants, whose workers actually don't reproduce and devote their lives to the colony and the queen. Moving on to section 8.2, we now get to discuss something a little bit more ecologically focused. Here, we discuss the flow of energy and matter through the ecosystem. In Unit 3 on energetics, we learned that all organisms require energy to survive and reproduce. This is because energy is the capacity to do work, and all living things perform chemical works to build themselves, transport work to move substrates across membranes, and even mechanical work to move things both inside and outside of their cells. Let's begin with the flow of energy in the form of organic matter, be it sugar or meat, through the ecosystem. In this brief review of a similar topic in Unit 3, we see that the sun acts as the initial source of energy in terrestrial ecosystems. The electromagnetic radiation that arrives on our planet is captured by plants, which can use this energy in photosynthesis to fix inorganic carbon dioxide into sugars. In other words, electromagnetic energy is converted into chemical energy, now held within the calories contained in the sugars. The plants can break sugars down to create ATPs for themselves, and they can store much of this sugar as starch or sucrose in their tissues too. Now, this second point is quite important because the fact that they can produce sugars not only for themselves, but also for the ecosystem earns them the name of primary producers. Just keep in mind that in systems where sunlight can't reach, like near hydrothermal vents in the depth of the ocean, we see chemosynthetic bacteria that act as the primary producers, converting inorganic substances into organic sugars using chemicals instead of light. The next level up is primary consumers. In our terrestrial ecosystem example, the primary consumers are the second level just above the primary producers, and they exclusively feed on these producers. They're typically referred to as herbivores, as the producers are generally plant species. We see many species of insects and small animals alike, like rabbits and squirrels. Next up, we have secondary consumers, which feed on those primary consumers. These would be technically carnivores and can include species like snakes, birds, and frogs, as many of these creatures eat small animals or insects that ate the plants beneath them. But in many systems, we also see tertiary consumers, which can often be called apex predators of the system, given that there's nothing that eats them. They often eat not only the secondary consumers, but also the primary consumers too. Hawks, wolves, and lions can act as tertiary consumers, although in more complex relationships, they could even go up to another level to quaternary consumer level 2. Now, we can also throw in decomposers into the mix as they work at each level to release organic substances in dead tissues of plants, herbivores, and carnivores alike back to the environment. These can include bacteria, earthworms, and some species of fungus. The most important thing to note here, though, is what we call the 10% rule, which indicates that only 10% of the energy existing at a particular level can move up to the next. So for instance, if there were 50,000 joules of energy in the primary consumer level, only 5,000 joules would be available at the secondary consumer level. This is because organisms actually use energy for themselves and release heat and even waste products that generally account for the other 90% of the energy that they do not pass on. Now, while this type of generalized picture of energy flow is useful in understanding the efficiency of energy transfer, it doesn't really tell us all that much about specific feeding relationships between species in an ecosystem. So one of the most common models that we see in AP Bio is the food web. In a food web, we see numerous arrows interconnecting species in a particular community. Most of what we see is fairly obvious, but you should be able to predict cascading effects as one parameter changes and affects another. So for instance, an increase in a predator population may decrease the prey, which may have a positive impact on the height of trees, for instance. This very phenomenon was actually observed in Yellowstone National Park, where the reintroduction of wolves decreased the elk population, which typically grazed on the aspen trees. With an increase in the wolf population, the elk population declined, and as a result, the aspen trees grew taller as they were able to escape that grazing pressure. Now, one additional note here is that food webs in non-terrestrial systems may not include plants as the foundation. As mentioned before, we're most likely going to see or infer the existence of chemosynthetic bacteria that have the capacity to use chemicals as a means to derive energy necessary to convert inorganic carbon into sugar. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, 8.1 and 2 are a bit of a mixed bag, but I hope I was able to concisely gather most of what you need to be aware of for this AP Bio exam. And if you found this video helpful, be sure to click that like button and subscribe for more content just like this one. Most importantly, share this video with someone named Sienna, but only if she spells her name with 2 N's instead of 1. This has been Mikey with Avo Prep Academy, and we'll see you in the next video.